comparative advantage, right? So what are the benefits of free trade as discussed by comparative advantage? Exactly. Let's look at this question one more time, right? Where did it go? Explain the benefits of free trade as suggested by the principle of comparative advantage. Okay, now students, have a look at this. So starting off with, first thing that you have to do, as I've always told you, that at the start of the question, you have to mention the definition, give the definition of the keywords that are used in the question. So in this case, there are two keywords: what is free trade and what is comparative advantage. So free trade is relatively easier term. That means that free trade is when countries are trading among themselves without any trade barriers, and there are no restrictions like no trade barriers in terms of like tariff quotas and so on and so forth, right? So free trade is free movement of goods and services without any trade barriers. Now, what is comparative advantage? You would remember that there are two types of advantages that we talked about as part of our syllabus: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So these two models explain how countries specialize. How do countries specialize in terms of international trade? So either a country would be specializing on the basis of its absolute advantage, which means that they will be producing goods that they can produce in more quantity or in lower cost. What is absolute advantage? Absolute advantage is when a country can produce something at lower cost or in more quantity. That is absolute advantage. Yes or no, right? So either a country will be specializing in goods in which it has absolute advantage, or the country will be specializing in goods in which it has comparative advantage, right? Now, you are more expected to explain what comparative advantage is. What was the definition? So comparative advantage is when a country can produce something at lower opportunity cost. When you can produce something at lower opportunity cost. Excellent. Now listen to this, students, very carefully. Think about this. So you will say that every economy, right? Now, what are the benefits of free trade as discussed by comparative advantage? Every economy. Now, how is this an advantage if, how is this a benefit if countries are specializing on the basis of comparative advantage? Now, this is the question. Every economy has limited resources. Do you agree with me, right? Every economy has limited resources, which means that if they're using more of their resources on one type of product, they are giving up their production on the other type of product. Exactly. Now, so just listen to this very carefully. If an economy is using more resources, let's say Pakistan is spending more resources to make agricultural goods. Okay. Makes sense, right? So what else what would Pakistan be giving up on? So Pakistan would be giving up on things like, cell phones, cars, laptops, mobile phones, right? All these things, right? So what is important here to understand that every country has limited resources and therefore they face opportunity cost, just like any individual. And therefore it faces opportunity cost. Okay, now this is important. Now, if countries adopt comparative advantage, how would that be beneficial? That is what we have to explain, right? If there are two things like agriculture, right? Or let's forget about that. Let's say wheat and phones, right? And similarly, in the case of India as well, because we know when we make our model, we keep the same two goods for both the countries. We choose two countries and then we choose any two products produced in those countries, right? So let's say we are taking the examples of wheat and phones. Okay, now listen to this. If let's say Pakistan's ratio against phones is 1:2, right? And for India, it is 1:4, right? So I'm not making the entire table as we did in the class and we calculated the domestic opportunity cost ratios and all that stuff, right? Now, my simple and easy question to you would be, by looking at the values that are presented on the graph, on the whiteboard over here, which country has lower opportunity cost for wheat? Which country has lower opportunity cost for wheat? So what do you think? Right? Pakistan. Arbab, are you getting me? Think about this. What is lower opportunity cost? Opportunity cost means how much you have to give up on something, right? If you're choosing one thing. So if you're choosing something, what is it that you have to give up on, right? So in this case, if you're making wheat, right? Think about it. If you're making wheat in Pakistan, one wheat ratio, two phones. This means one wheat is equivalent to two phones. Either you can produce 1 unit of wheat in Pakistan, that could be kg, whatever, right? Against two phones. On the other hand, in case of India, to produce one wheat, that is equivalent to four cell phones, right? So either you can produce 1 unit of wheat or four cell phones. So India has to give up more. India has to, students, are you getting me? India has to give up more if they specialize in wheat because their opportunity cost is high, whereas Pakistan has to give up less um, has to give up less if they are making wheat because they only have to give up two cell phones, right? So this is the entire thing that you have to explain in this question, that what exactly comparative advantage states, what exactly comparative advantage is about, right? So then after you explain this, you will say that according to the law of comparative advantage, Pakistan should specialize in wheat, whereas India should specialize in phones, right? We did talk about this, that if you have calculated for one country, for one product, that which country has comparative advantage in which product, you don't need to do the opposite calculation. You can just assume because that will always be true. Did I tell you this or not, right? So in the case of comparative advantage, the very way comparative advantage is designed and the way this model is designed. So if you have already looked at these values and seen that Pakistan has comparative advantage in wheat, then you do not need to verify whether India has comparative advantage in votes. If you do the reverse calculation, which we did in the class, you would be able to see that India, the other country, would always have the comparative advantage in the other good, whatever it might be. Clear, easy, simple enough. So if Pakistan has competitive advantage in wheat because it has to give less of phones, right, to produce 1 kg of wheat compared to India. So we know Pakistan has competitive advantage in wheat, and therefore India would have in the other product, right? As simple as that. Okay, after you explain this entire example and all that stuff, then you will move on and say that what are the benefits? Look at this question one more time, right? What was the question saying here, right? So the question was saying, right, explain the benefits of free trade as suggested by the principle of comparative advantage. So you will say, when countries specialize on the basis of comparative advantage, they are making best possible use of their resources. How so? When countries are specializing on the basis of comparative advantage, right, on the basis of comparative advantage, I'm not writing the full form, I'm just writing, but you will not write it down like this on an exam. You have to write the full form. Comparative advantage, it means they are utilizing their resources for production of goods that give them the highest return. Utilizing their resources to, right, when countries are specializing on the basis of comparative advantage, it means that they are utilizing their resources to produce products, for which they do not have a high opportunity cost, for which they do not have high opportunity cost, and therefore right, they are making best possible use of their resources. How many of you got this? Let me explain you one more time. And therefore they're making best possible use of their resources. Okay, students, listen to this very carefully. Now think about this. Comparative advantage says that countries should specialize in products in which they have less, in which they have less opportunity cost, right? So if a country is producing something for which it has to give up a lot of other things, I repeat, if a country is producing something for which it has to give up a lot of other things, right? So if Pakistan, if instead of Pakistan, India produces wheat, then the problem is that instead of this one unit of wheat, they could have produced 4 phones. So what product should their resources be used for? Their resources should be used for things that will give them higher return, which is phones in this case. On the other hand, if Pakistan is specializing in wheat, it doesn't have to give up a lot. It doesn't need to give up on a lot of phones, right? So Pakistan has lower opportunity cost of wheat, right? So it isn't giving up on a lot. So where would you spend your resources? Where the opportunity cost is less, right? So with that happening, every country would be making the best possible use of their resources by spending their resources on things that have, by spending their resources on products that give them more return, or in simple words, for products where they have to give up less of another thing, right? Then when you do that, obviously overall world output levels are higher, right? Overall output levels after trade and specialization is higher. Uh, right? World production, right? Because every country is utilizing its resources in the best possible way. Overall world production of goods is higher, and so countries exchange sell surplus of goods they produced against goods that they did not produce. That they did not produce. This is making sense, students, right? So then what happens when every country is specializing in products that their resources are better suited to, right? Then they will be able to produce a surplus of that good. What do? They export their surplus to other countries and in exchange buy the products that they did not produce on their own, right? So this is how trade benefits them. Then another thing that you need to mention in this question is the concept of trade. Right? Is this making sense, students? Yeah. So that is what you need to explain. Consumer gets better quality, exactly, right? Consumers can get better quality. Um, what else? As every country is specializing in a specific specializing, right? So think about this. Have you ever heard the terms like if you want to buy cigars, buy Cuban cigars? If you have to buy shoes, the best shoes in the world are Italian. Similarly, if you have to buy, I don't know, wine, French wine, or I don't know which country wine is best or whatever, right? So why all of these things exist? So all of these examples exist because of the fact that over the years, countries have specialized to so much extent that their identity is, connected with the product, right? They have become so good that their identity is connected with that. Right, just a second, right? So the thing is that consumers get better quality products as I wanted right, every country specializing in goods that they are goods or services that they're good at producing. So automatically consumer well-being will be high, right? Good at producing, which you can also link with the concept that prices would be low. Why would prices be low? Students, think about this. So when every country is specializing, they are producing in larger quantities. When they produce in large quantities, what happens? There is economies of scale, right? We did talk about this, right? So economies of scale happens when the average cost of production decreases as you produce more output of a good, right? So on the x-axis, you will have output. So output is increasing on the x-axis, and you have average total cost on the on the y-axis. So when you're producing in larger quantities, your average total cost will start to fall, and you will see that it will form a U-shaped graph like this, right? So the countries are specializing. Previously, they had to produce everything. Without free trade, without comparative advantage, they would be producing everything because the consumers need everything. So Pakistan has to produce phones, has to produce wheat, has to produce everything, and Pakistan cannot specialize. But now when there is free trade taking place, Pakistan can only specialize on things that it's good at producing, right? So in that case, what happens? We will be producing more of the good that we are good at producing, and we will exchange the surplus with other things that we don't produce, right? And when we are specializing in something, we produce larger quantity of that, and therefore its average total cost will decrease, and we can transfer this benefit to consumers in terms of lower prices. We can transfer this benefit to consumers in terms of lower prices. Is this making sense, right? Okay, now you asked me, Abdul, that what are the cons of using comparative advantage and absolute advantage. The only disadvantage that a country can have with free trade, right? Because it's talking about right? The only disadvantage that can happen in this case is that you become dependent on other economies. The only thing that can be a disadvantage, dependent on foreign countries. Are you getting me, Abduri? So what happens, think about this, with all this international trade taking place between countries and all that stuff, a lot of products in Pakistan are not even produced, right? So in case for some reason in future, if let's say the country that we were importing from refuses to give us those products, or let's say they themselves are short of those products, then we have become dependent on them. But otherwise, in terms of variety, in terms of quality, in terms of prices, everyone would be better off. Everyone would be better off when countries are specializing. Everyone would be better off when countries are specializing. But the only disadvantage of free trade and being dependent on some other country is that if in case future something goes wrong, they have stopped exporting that product to you, or let's say your relations with them deteriorate and they have imposed some restrictions on you, or the prices are going higher, then you will have dependency on that foreign country. That's the only disadvantage. Are we good? Okay, now let's move on. Let's do another question. Explain the limitations of comparative advantage in accounting for a country's pattern of trade. Okay, now that should be simple and easy. Small businesses are neglected as their products won't be sold domestically or internationally as we don't have the best quality. True. That's another disadvantage. Very good point. Very good point, Abhinav, that in some cases, small producers, local producers, of your country will be negatively affected because there are cheaper imports coming from other countries, and your local consumers would prefer those, and obviously these small businesses are not even are in position to export these products, so the local industry will not establish. Yes, absolutely, that's correct, 110%. Great, very good. Okay, now students, can you move on? Now look at the next point. The next question says, explain the limitations of the theory of comparative advantage in accounting for the country's pattern of trade. 8 marks. Now, listen to this very carefully. When it says pattern of trade, now what it means is that they're talking about that on what basis do countries specialize? On what basis? On what basis? On what basis do countries specialize? Students, are you getting me? Okay, now think about this. So pattern of trade, or this thing. So pattern of trade basically means that which products would a country specialize in, right? So as we know that developing countries, including Pakistan, generally specialize in things like, agricultural goods and primary products. On the other hand, developed countries are more focused on services or manufactured goods and so on, right? So this is exactly what the question is saying. Now, what it's asking us to mention, explain the limitations of the theory of comparative advantage in accounting for the country's pattern of trade. Now, what things comparative advantage theory doesn't predict? What basis, right? Comparative advantage, what basis countries can specialize in, which comparative advantage doesn't account for. This is what the question is saying. Students, are you getting what the wording is saying? Are you making sense? So first thing that you have to say is that there are two models, right? Two bases that we have already studied in class, on the basis of which countries specialize, right? One is absolute advantage and the other one is comparative advantage. So you will say that apart from, first of all, obviously in this question, you will explain what is comparative advantage. You can use the same example that I've told you, right? So you will say comparative advantage is when a country specializes in a product in which it has lower opportunity cost. That's a product that they specialize in. So you'll explain all this comparative advantage first in detail, because you have to explain that how comparative advantage predicts the pattern of trade. So the first thing that you have to do is to explain how comparative advantage predicts the pattern of trade. And for that, you have to mention the entire story that we discussed in the previous question as well, that comparative advantage is when a country can produce something at lower cost. You can use the same example that we discussed in the previous question of Pakistan, China, India, or whatever country. So you just need to take, think of any two countries and then think of any two products, let's say wheat and phones or whatever, right? And then assume some imaginary values to show that which country has lower opportunity cost and which product, right? So we are sticking to the same example that we did in the previous question. So let's say 1 kg of wheat in Pakistan is equivalent to 2 phones, whereas 1 kg of wheat in China is equivalent to, let's say, 3 phones. Now we can see for ourselves that to produce 1 unit of wheat, Pakistan only has to give up on 2 units of phones, whereas China has to give up on 3 units of phones, right? So this means that China will give up more if they specialize on wheat. China will give up more of phones if they specialize in wheat. So ideally, they should focus on phones. And Pakistan, which has lower opportunity cost in wheat, that is the country that will specialize in wheat. Does this make sense, right? So you will give this entire explanation and all that. Then you will say that what is another model that predicts pattern of trade? What is another model that predicts pattern of trade? For that, you will say it's absolute advantage. Now, what does absolute advantage say? You can also make a graph if you want to. Absolute advantage says that when a country can produce something in larger quantity or at lower cost. Now, think about it. It's very simple to assume and imagine that if something is cheaper in the world, lower cost of production, exactly. So if something is of lower cost, right, that is the product that you would want to that is the country from where you would want to import, right? So let's say, again, let's assume the same two products, wheat and phones, right? And two countries, Pakistan and China. You have wheat and phones, and you have downward sloping is, let's say, this is for, let's say, Pakistan, right? And then you'll make similar production possibility curve for China, which, let's say, goes like this, right? So this is for China. Now, just by looking at the graph, we can tell that China can produce more quantity of phones compared to Pakistan, right? But it's making less quantity of wheat compared to Pakistan, right? Are you getting me? And in this case, let's say 6,000, right? Okay, now which country has absolute advantage in which good? So we did talk about this. So if a country can produce something in larger quantities or at lower cost, that is the country in which it has absolute advantage. So in this case, China has absolute advantage in phones. It can produce more quantity, right? Whereas Pakistan has absolute advantage in wheat, right? So lower cost of production is very good, excellent. So lower cost of production is definitely an advantage, and it's very simple and intuitive to understand. If Pakistan has to import something from two countries, just imagine how would you compare. So if you can buy something from USA and UK, right? I'm giving you your example, right? So think of yourself as a consumer, and if you have two options to compare, USA and UK, and you find out that the same product in US is costing you $10, whereas in UK it's costing you $12. So obviously, it's your natural choice to buy from USA because that is cheaper, right? So that is what absolute advantage means, right? So if something is cheaper, uh, that is the product or the country you will import from. Then what are some other basis? So we've already explained absolute advantage. Above, are you following? We have already explained comparative advantage that we did at the start of the question, that what is comparative advantage, how it predicts pattern of trade. Then we talked about absolute advantage right now, and we said that absolute advantage can also predict patterns of trade. Then what are some other things, right? Then you can also mention some other basis for specialization. What can be some other basis for specialization, right? So if a country has produced something over the years, what we were just talking about in the last question, other basis for specialization. So if Italian, shoes are so, or Cuban cigars, right, are so popular, right, because they have done this over, long years, like over a couple of years, these countries have specialized in these products. Then it is obviously understandable that they are leading producers in that, right? So let me give you another example. So BMW car is not very cheap. Do you agree with me? Right? And BMW might take a lot of resources because it's so luxury car and so expensive, right? So Germany might not have either absolute advantage or comparative advantage in producing cars, right? But why would people still buy from them? Because they have such unique selling points. German cars have such unique selling points. They're so unique, right, in terms of quality, in terms of all that stuff, that people would still want to import from Germany. Students, is this making sense? Is this making sense? Right? So that's another thing. Okay. Right, perfect. Right. So that could be another basis for specialization. You can call that as product exclusiveness, or you can say, put it in other words, long established history of quality, right? So now these are not cheap, but they have some unique selling points of quality and so on. Long established history of quality, reputation, uniqueness, etc. Right? So this is what you need to explain. Any confusion so far, students? Anything that's not clear? Customers are loyal, exactly. Customers want to buy. Customer loyalty is high, and so on. Right? So these three would be enough. So in this question, what we did, let's quickly recap and then do one more question after this. Right? So we have talked about that. What the question was saying? Explain the right. Right, explain the limitation. So you first have to explain that how comparative advantage predicts the pattern of trade, and then you have to talk about other bases on which countries can specialize. So you explain what is comparative advantage, you gave the entire explanation, then you talked about that other basis for trade could be absolute advantage if you can produce something at a lower cost, and yet another basis for trade specialization would be country's reputation for quality or unique product or exclusiveness and so on. So after that you will explain that, right? Okay, great. So these two questions we have done. Then are these the question of the dream that you want us to do? With the help of a diagram, explain how both cost push and demand inflation can be caused by a falling exchange rate. Okay, this sounds interesting. Yes, no, no. Policies question. Okay, tell me what acts as a modern. Okay. Um, did you share these ones? But this is inflation. Right, just a second, just a second. Why is this not helping? Right, just a second. I think, right. Right, this one, right? Right. Okay, let's do a question on inflation then, right? Analyze how fiscal and monetary policy can be used to problem of deflation. We did this yesterday. Causes of aggregate supply, advantage and disadvantages of regional switching policy, discuss the ways in which reducing switching policy attempt to remove a current account deficit. Okay, let's do one question about inflation, right? So that's what you're saying, Arbab, right? So let's do a question about inflation. Main causes of change in general price level in the country, right? Policies to right. Just a second. Do we have a question on inflation? Okay, great, perfect. This sounds good. Okay, discuss how effective monetary policy is likely to be in correcting both inflation and deflation when they each occur in an economy. 12 marks. Explain two policies that might be considered to solve the problems demand for inflation and evaluate which is likely to be more effective. Okay, now let's do the bottom one today, and then tomorrow we'll do the up one. Right, perfect. Thank you so much, Abdullah. Okay, now if you're doing the bottom question, think about this. What is this question saying? Compare two policies that may be considered to solve the problem of demand pull inflation and evaluate which is likely to be more effective. Okay, now think about this. First thing that you have to explain is that what is demand pull inflation? So if you remember, we talked about it in our class that there are two basic types of causes of inflation: demand pull inflation and cost push. So demand pull inflation happens when the aggregate demand of an economy increases for some reason, or in simple words, when the component of aggregate demand is increasing, like which can be consumption or investment or government spending and so on. On the y-axis, you have general price level, and on the x-axis, you have real GDP, right? So first things first, you will show the original position of aggregate demand in an economy, downward sloping like this, right? AD1, and upward sloping will be the aggregate supply of an economy like this, AS1, where the two intersect. That will show you original equilibrium position, which will also show you your general price level. Right now, we're only interested in inflation, so we just look at where the price level was previously. Now, what happens when any component of aggregate demand is increasing, which includes consumption, C plus I, investment plus G, government spending plus exports minus imports, right? So when that happens, your aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, it shifts upwards like this, and that results in a higher general price level, meaning higher inflation. Okay. Now, this being said, the question is saying that what are the two policies that can be used to correct this, right? Two policies that may be considered to solve the problem of demand for inflation, evaluate which is likely to be more effective. Okay. Now, students, think about this. One policy that we'll talk about is your contractionary, what policy? Your contractionary fiscal policy, right? And another policy that you can talk about is perhaps supply side policies, right? You can also talk about contractionary monetary policy, right? But I mean, it totally depends on you, right? So the contractionary fiscal policy is when you increase your taxes and reduce government spending. That's one way of going about this, right? And another policy that you can use is your contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy, right? Monetary policy. Okay, think about this. Now, what do we do in contractionary fiscal policy, right? Increase, exactly. So in contractionary fiscal policy, Arbab, what you do is that since you are trying to reduce the spending in the economy, you will increase your taxes. Because think about this, I did tell you that when you have to contract, which means you have to shrink the size of the economy, what will you do? You will limit people's spending power. And this is exactly what happens in demand inflation. Since people are spending more, the aggregate demand is increasing, as we just saw on the graph. That will cause a rightward shift in aggregate demand and therefore higher price level. Now, what is your target? What is the country's target? The country's target is to bring these components down, bring consumer spending low, so that your aggregate demand curve can either come back to this original level, or perhaps it can even go to the left, right? A slightly left to where it was previously, right? Now, for that, what will you do? If you increase your taxes, your consumption will fall. So consumption will fall, people have low purchasing power, more amount is taken away by the government. Similarly, when G is decreasing, that will also cause it to fall and your overall spending in the economy will fall. So your aggregate demand curve will shift to the left like this, right? This is making sense. So that's one way of going about this, which in that case, your GDP will decrease, but at the same time, GDP will decrease and unemployment will increase, yes. But the benefit that we have, that the country will get out of this is lower price level, lower inflation, yes. So there will be another negative effect that we have talked about, that your GDP would also fall, right? So when you come back to this original level, you can see that your GDP would fall compared to this level, but obviously it also gives you an advantage of lower inflation, which the country was trying to achieve. Okay, now moving on, students, think about this. Lower inflation, it means lower inflation. Yeah. So Abdul, that's a good question. So when you're moving down on the journal price level, think about this. This is journal price level. So when you move down on the graph, that means it's lower rate of inflation. It's still inflation, disinflation. So as you said, exactly, it means disinflation, right? There is still inflation. The prices are still going up, but those prices are going up at a slower rate. Those prices are going up at a slower rate. So technically on this graph, we can't really show deflation because, as I said, deflation is very, like, that happens in very rare circumstances. Right? Are we good on this? Right, they are stabilizing. Exactly. So that is one thing that we talk about. Another policy that I would ideally want to talk about in this question, instead of contractionary monetary policy, you can also talk about contractionary monetary policy. What happens in contractionary monetary policy? You increase the interest rates. When you increase the interest rates, that would obviously do what? That would increase your borrowing, right? That will increase the cost of borrowing, right? It will be now more expensive to borrow from a bank, and therefore your consumption would fall, your government, consumption would fall, and your investment would decrease because businesses will find more expensive to borrow and all that stuff. When this happens, what would that do? Your aggregate demand would fall, and again, same effect would happen. But I would be more interested in, for this question, to talk about, right. I would be personally more interested to talk about supply side policies. So if you remember, we talked about supply side policies, that when your aggregate supply increases, what are some of the things that you do, right? So you provide more subsidies. Government tries to facilitate new businesses by reducing their cost of production. How? By giving them tax holidays, by giving training to their workers and laborers to make them more productive and all that stuff. In that case, it's not the aggregate demand that will shift, but instead, sorry about that, but instead, what would that do? That would cause your supply curve to shift to the right. So that would cause your supply curve to shift to the right. Are you getting me? Now, this is your new supply curve, and this was your new aggregate demand. So your aggregate demand has stayed where it was. So it didn't shift it back. But you can see that with rightward shift in aggregate supply, your prices are again at the same level where they were. So are you getting me? Right? So this is the benefit of